What makes America great. It's entrepreneurs and, America.
Hello and welcome back to Visa Vibes. I'm Emily Newman, the managing partner of Reddy Newman Brown PC in Houston, Texas. And with me today is my partner, Stephen Brown. Together we help businesses, professionals, families navigate the ever-changing landscape of U.S. immigration law. Today, what are we going to be talking about?
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite topics in immigration, Emily, because I think it's what makes America great. It's entrepreneurs. And, America as a whole has been favorable to entrepreneurs, both domestically and internationally. And we're going to talk about kind of the immigration routes folks that are abroad or here in the U.S. that aren't citizens can take to form their business and run it.
All right. Yeah. And immigration is a little interesting when it comes to entrepreneurs because there's some areas that were designed for entrepreneurship and others that were not and kind of have band-aids that kind of allow it and others don't allow it at all. We'll kind of go through all of those different options.
It's kind of one of my favorite puzzles, right? Somebody comes in and says, hey, I have this idea. I want to do this. Okay. Where are you from? What is your situation now? Because where you're from is going to have an impact. What your situation now is going to have an impact, what your long-term goals are, what the foreign... there's so many pieces when we're talking about someone who has an idea. And we've heard of some really cool ideas from people, and it's how do we figure this out for them? So let's dive in.
All right. So kind of one of the categories of visas that allows entrepreneurship to an extent is the business visa. Makes sense. Business visa for entrepreneurs. This is the B1 visa. It is a temporary visa. It is a very short-term visa. Maximum amount of time you can be in the U.S. is 6 months. Sometimes they only let you in for 90 days. They basically decide when you're entering, based on what your purpose is, how long you'll be let into the country. But it is meant for people who are maybe exploring their options for business ventures in the U.S. Maybe you need to attend some meetings, participate in some negotiate some contracts, meet with business associates, attend a conference, be at an expo or something for your company if you're already up and running in your home country. The downside of this is you can't do work. So you can do business but not work, and that's a very fine line, and sometimes it's hard to differentiate between the two. But once you get, you could incorporate the business, you can open up a bank account, get your tax ID number, find a lease space where you're going to be.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs, Emily, use B1 to get to the next step, right? Because they want to come in and they have the idea, so they want to work. But there's so many steps that have to be done before you can just come in and say, I'm working today. And so I've seen the B1, yes, there are businesses that are well established that use the B1 for meetings and all that, contract negotiations, like you said, but I've also seen it as people who come in to take B1 legitimate steps to get to the next step. Maybe, we've seen it for new office Ls, which I think we're going to talk about quite a bit here. The B1's a good one, but it doesn't let you work.
Yeah. And there's, depending on what country you're from, as you mentioned, a lot of these options are country specific. You may qualify for what we call Visa Waiver Program, or what a lot of people refer to as ESTA, where you don't actually need a visa stamp in your passport. You don't have to go through the consulate if you're from countries that are Visa Waiver Program countries. You travel to the U.S. and you can do that for business purposes. It's not just for tourism or visiting for pleasure, but that's limited to 90 days maximum. And again, you've got to be real careful about what your activities are. If you're getting to the point where you're hiring people, firing, paying, coming into the office, doing the books, that kind of stuff, you may have crossed the line. So you've got to be very careful about that.
Yeah, and I think the one thing to remember with B1 and ESTA and all that I think people don't remember is that the U.S. doesn't use those as like a nomad visa, right? A lot of countries have a nomad visa. You're hanging out in their country and you're working completely remotely for the foreign country entity. You're not doing anything for a U.S. entity. The U.S. doesn't have that. So be careful, like you said, with what you're doing on the B1.
All right. Next option, which can work if you have a company outside the U.S. already and are looking to expand into the U.S., maybe to check things out. You come in on the B1 visa for up to 6 months, and now you're really ready to expand and open up the business and start operating. That's where an L1 visa might come into play. This is for multinational companies that allow someone who's worked outside the U.S. for the company as a manager, executive, or specialized knowledge. But when we're talking about startups, it's usually the managers or executives that are brought over to the U.S. first to get the office up and running. And these are referred to as new office Ls. For a new office L, you always have to show that the company in the U.S. already has the physical space where the work is going to be done. So you can't start the process until you've got a lease or you've bought physical space where you're going to be at. You had to have worked for the company abroad for at least 1 year in that managerial, executive, or specialized knowledge capacity. The U.S. company that you're setting up and the foreign company have to have a qualifying relationship. So shared ownership, shared control. There's multiple different ways to accomplish that. With these new offices, you've really got to be able to show that the U.S. business is at a point where it's going to grow enough to support a managerial or executive role within 1 year, because you're only going to get the new office L for 1 year. Then you have to file the extension. When it's time to file that extension, you have to show what have you accomplished in that last year. And so if business growth is slow, maybe COVID happens or something happens with the economy, that can really throw a wrench into your long-term stay. But the great thing about the L is it's for 7 years if you get an L1A. That gives you a long period of time to really get things up and running and get that business going. And it kind of has a path to a green card as well.
And you can, with the L1, the L1A, we had this episode a few episodes ago more in depth on the L1, but it has that twin sister, the EB1C, which is the green card. Now, you can't go from a new office that 1 year and then go to the EB1C, so you have to get the extension. And L1 new office is tricky. USCIS is very strict on that financial viability side where, hey, we are going to require an executive next year. And what do they look at as executive capacity is not, I'm the CEO, I'm running things. It's more nuanced. So check out that last episode on L1s, but it's still a path, and it's a very successful path. And it's one of those that L1 as a whole isn't for entrepreneurs, but they've made this carve out for new offices.
Mm-hmm. And it does require that you have that company abroad. So it may not work for everyone if you're not at that stage or you don't have a business set up abroad. Then maybe an e-visa could be an option, because you don't necessarily have to have that company abroad. It's specifically meant for investors. So if you are from an e-treaty country, that's the downside. It only works for certain countries. But assuming that you are, if you're planning to come to the U.S. and invest, buy a business, start a business, you can use that business to get a visa that allows you to work and run that business as the investor, as a manager or executive. You can bring over other people that are from the same country to work for you as manager, executive, specialized knowledge. And they don't have to have worked for you outside the U.S. like you do for an L. So sometimes an L might be better if you're not from a treaty country, but if you are from a treaty country and you don't have that business presence abroad, an e-visa can be a great option. You do have to invest a substantial amount of capital, which is not really
nobody
defined.
knows. It's USCIS it's relative to the business, and so maybe 10,000 is substantial, maybe 50,000 is substantial. I've heard rumors that some consulates have a dollar figure in their operating manual for that consulate that's kind of a hidden figure that people learn as they go. But yeah, it's all relative to the business, what substantial is.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing with the e-visa is you actually make the application with the consulate. There's no filing with USCIS unless you happen to be in the U.S. and want to go through that hassle. But generally, you submit everything to the consulate. And so they're going to decide, as you said, like if this amount that you're planning to invest is substantial. Another thing you have to prove is that the investment is not, the company that you're creating is not marginal. It has to create more jobs than just yours.
Right.
So you've got to have plans to grow it enough to employ yourself, give yourself a salary, make a profit, and hire U.S. workers. Ultimately, is what they want to see.
Yeah, and one rumor that I've always heard is there are, we go around Houston. There's all sorts of diverse food here, and I've heard, companies that's how they've started it. They have, hey, I've got a really good restaurant here, Thai food, especially. I've heard that rumor that a lot of it's through e-visa trade. So it's not limited to, like an H-1B. It's got to be a degree in a specific field, but it does have to show that business growth and go with the economy, but not as strict as EB-5. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So EB-5 green card program. And this is our investor-based green card. This is a direct path to a green card. You can do this abroad. A lot of people do. You can do it while you're in the U.S. on a non-immigrant visa. And, they redid everything EB-5 related in 2022. The Regional Center program sunset, so they did the EB-5 Regional Center Integrity Act, reset all the dollar figures, reset some of the rules. And now what we've got is, you got EB-5 and then two subtypes. And you have targeted or reserved or unreserved EB-5s. And the investment amount changes. What you have to prove, is about the same. But our targeted areas are going to be areas of high unemployment, rural areas, or if you've got an infrastructure project, they have certain visas set aside specifically. There's only X number of visas available. Some are set aside. If you're investing in a targeted area, it's 800,000. If you're in a non-targeted area, it's a little over $1 million, 50, I think it is, 50,000. But it's not just, here's my money, give me a green card. You have to show that your green card, that your investment is going to create 10 U.S. jobs. That's U.S. workers. That's not non-immigrant workers. That's U.S. citizens and other similarly situated based off of how the INA defines this. And there is a big dig into source of funds. And we've seen this. You need to show the legality of how you've acquired your $800,000. And I joke with clients, Emily, but it's like dollar for dollar. Where I got $799,999 accounted for, but this one came from something illegal, and they're going to look that deep into it, and not necessarily illegal as in criminal, but some have been regulatory issues, sales of businesses that had violations of I-9s. So it's really good though, especially right now. For backlog countries, China and India, the reserved category is current. So you can, if you're in the U.S., you're in that backlog, you can file, or abroad, you can file for the EB-5 and immediately apply for a green card. If you're in the U.S., concurrently file the 485, get the work travel benefits. And it really is interesting. From an entrepreneur perspective, you can create your own business, show you have a business plan, show you're going to create the 10 U.S. jobs. You could get the conditional green card. So any EB-5 is going to get a 2-year conditional green card. And then you remove conditions showing I actually did what I said I was going to do. I created these jobs. I invested the full amount. So it is a good path for those that have that. Proving job creation can be complex, though. I mean, if you just show, you got to keep good records of payroll and all that. So it is good, especially if you've got the funds available. The RIA really allowed for things like loans. HELOC is big right now with housing prices, so home equity loans. So really good option though.
All right. Now we have another entrepreneur category that's not quite a green card, also not quite a visa. Was specifically created for entrepreneurs, but practically nobody uses it. And this is the International Entrepreneur Parole. So this was created by regulation many, many years ago. So it's meant more for companies that are kind of going through the venture capital startup ecosystem kind of situation. Where you have a substantial ownership interest in the company. You've got to own, I think, a minimum of 10%. you have to have a certain dollar amount of qualified investments within 18 months prior to filing. The qualified investments are you either got some venture capital seed funding, and then they're going to look at, okay, these venture capital angel investors, it's not good enough just to be a venture capitalist or an angel investor. They have to have their own track record of success.
Yeah.
So you've got to prove the investment came from a qualified place, and that qualified place is also qualified.
Yeah, and it's really weird, right? Because it's not just, you and I could say, hey, we see someone with a really good idea, we're going to invest in it. It has to be, like you said, they've got that track record. It has to be a U.S. citizen, lawful permanent residents, or organizations in the U.S. that are controlled by U.S. citizens or green card holders. And then they have that track record of investment. So, like you said, it's really this venture capital type investment. And you talk about the complexity and weirdness and how structured this is. 8 years that this has been around, about 130 applications and 30 as of June 2023 approvals. Okay, over 8 years. So not a widely used program because, one, like you said, not status, so you can't do anything after, right? It is a good program. It is there. It's a 5-year maximum parole to be here in the U.S., but you can't adjust status, to get a green card in the U.S. You can't change to an H-1B. You'd have to go abroad or whatever. And then, only certain companies qualify. They have to have that qualified investor. So it's there. It's very rarely used. That's for sure.
Yeah. So those are all the different categories that kind of are specifically created for investors and entrepreneurs. But there are other categories that can work for investors and entrepreneurs. And one of them is a more recent category, the H-1B. We actually had a new regulation that took effect January 2025, so very recently, that basically allows someone to get an H-1B to work for the company that they own.
Yep.
It's got some restrictions on it, so it's not really self-employment. You have to have a valid legal entity, so you have to actually incorporate or create an LLC or whatever corporate structure you want. You have to get the FEIN number from the IRS. You have to actually be doing specialty occupation work. So with all those other categories we talked about, you can actually be running the business and doing the business, and that qualifies as activities under those categories. But for this category, for an H-1B, you really can't spend most of your time running the business and doing the business. You actually have to do work that requires a bachelor's degree that's in the field that you have.
Yeah.
So that makes it a little bit stricter. Let's say you are a software developer and you've developed some cool new app or something, and you're going to create a business out of it, and you want to work for your business. Great. Well, the only thing you can do for the business, the majority of your time, is develop more software.
Yeah.
You can't spend the majority of your time marketing, negotiating contracts, finding those sales, all that sort of thing.
But, on the flip side of it, that's kind of what this new regulation did. You could always start a business on H-1B, but it was so tricky on H-1B because you had to spend 100% of your time only doing specialty occupation work. And used to have to, they used to look at this employer-employee relationship, meaning you had to have other people who could hire and fire you. With the new regulation, it did kind of two things. One, got rid of this employer-employee relationship and said it's a bona fide job opportunity, meaning you can be one person that forms an LLC and you can work for your business, but also it created this idea of you could spend a majority of the time doing specialty occupation work and a minority of the time running the business, where in the past you couldn't do that business operation stuff. It had to only be H-1B work. So there is, kind of more, it is structured for sure, but it allows more, it's more beneficial for startups than it ever was previously. I mean, we had some approved previously, but they had to hire board members that can fire them and somebody that can run payroll Now they can kind of do some of that, but that's not without kind of they gave, now you got to take, right?
Yeah, they do reduce the validity period of the H-1B. So normally when you file, you can always get a 3-year period, renew it for 3 years, and then if you are working your way through the green card process, extend beyond the normal 6-year limit. For this H-1B entrepreneur option, the first application is limited to only 18 months, so 1.5 years of approval. And then when you file your next extension, you still only get 1.5 years. Then after that, assuming everything is up and running and in compliance, then you can get your typical 3-year extensions.
Yeah, and my theory, we've gotten one of these approved already, at least one, because it's just, a month and a half that this has been around, is that they're going to look a lot stronger to that second one. That's not to say they're not going to do a lot of digging on the first one, but I kind of view it as kind of that conditional residence that you have with the EB-5. Like, did you actually do what you said you were going to do? So I don't think people are going to be able to just kind of use this to maneuver around things unless they have a real business, which plenty do. We've talked to plenty of people, doctors that want to buy up a practice or start their own, or dentists, whatever it might be. I've seen people with AI ideas that are like, I've got this idea, I've kind of been doing it as a hobby, now I want to monetize it. Great, do it. So it's there, it's working. Knock on wood, we haven't seen anything to kind of bring it back with it being a new regulation.
Yeah. And it definitely is more suited to people who already have an H-1B, because the H-1B is capped. That means there's a lottery that you have to go through. So if you've already gotten an H-1B with another employer, it makes it much easier to do this entrepreneur H-1B. Doesn't mean you can't do it,
right,
if you've never had it before, but it means you would have to enter yourself in the lottery, basically. And then hope that you get selected, and then file a petition and get the approval that won't take effect until October. So that makes it much more difficult.
Now, let me ask you, Emily, because this is a question we get a lot. I'm working for a company, like my job, but I also want to do my own thing at the same time and monetize it. Can I do both?
Yeah, that is a great thing with H-1B. It allows for concurrent employment, so you can actually have 2 employers at the same time. You can have more than 2. There's no limit on that. Very common for people in the healthcare field to have multiple employers. So yeah, you can definitely do that. Continue your normal full-time job, and then on the side you can specify a range of hours. Maybe you're going to spend 40 hours a week on your side job. Maybe you're only going to spend 5 hours a week. You can put a range in there. But you do have to make sure that you're qualifying with the prevailing wage and paying the salary and all of that, which can be a little hard for startups. So you've got to have the funds available to reach those requirements.
I do think it's a good option. Every time I watch Shark Tank, that's always the question they ask. Like, are you full-time, or are you still kind of doing both? But I think it kind of gives a little bit of a safety net there for those that can make it work with both. Emily, with our next one, we'll kind of talk about 2 together, the O1 and EB1A, green card, and the O1 non-immigrant visa, because they're, again, kind of like the L1, EB1C. They're twins, right? They're very similar, but these are extraordinary ability. And I know you and I were talking last week, like, what does that mean outside the regulatory context? And I'll tell the listeners, one of my lines that I use for anybody who talks about these cases, there was a Fifth Circuit case from the Court of Appeals a few years back, individuals challenging their EB-1 denial, and the court said that USCIS wasn't wrong in determining that he wasn't extraordinary, but that he was merely very good. And I think that gives a good color to what is extraordinary. There's a big difference between very good and extraordinary, top tier, right?
Yeah, they're definitely looking for cream of the crop. You've risen to the top of your field. And so how does the O1 work for an entrepreneur? The downside of it is it does require an employer sponsor or an agent to sponsor it. So you're not really, again, it's not exactly meant for entrepreneurs. Yeah. But if you do have that extraordinary ability that you've already developed through what you've done previously, maybe in your home country or while you're in the U.S. in another category, you have to show that you have met at least 3 of these list of criteria high-level awards, membership in organizations that require outstanding achievement of their members, if there's been published material about you, you've maybe participated and judged the work of others, either individually or on a panel. They want to see your original scientific or scholarly or business-related contributions to the field, and they have to be of major significance. Right. Authorship of scholarly articles, that tends to be more on the sciencey side, but there might be something similar that businesses can do.
I mean, I think if you write an article for the Wall Street Journal or, a business, there are business publications out there that you could still write for. But it does have to be a major publication still, not just the newsletter that goes out.
And then you could potentially show that you have worked in a critical or essential capacity for another company that has a distinguished reputation. They look at your salary, if you have a high salary or high remuneration compared to what other people make doing that same kind of work, or other comparable evidence. You have to show that you've met at least 3 of those, and that kind of looking at all of that, it shows that you've made these original contributions of major significance and that you've really risen to the top. The O1 is a non-immigrant intent visa, so it's meant to be short term, but it can technically be renewed indefinitely. There's no limit to it. Yeah. Doesn't necessarily have a direct path to the green card, but it does have the green card twin that is an option, the EB-1A.
Yeah, so the EB-1A, it's kind of like, it is that path forward. You have to do the I-140 and again show, hey, I meet these. It's the same criteria. Still got to show 3 out of the 8. Now, on the green card side, 2 extra things that they're going to look at. One, does the company have the ability to pay the salary? And then, especially on the green card side, there's what's called the Kazarian, step 2. Old court case on EB-1s where the court came up with this 2-pronged test. Do you meet the regulatory criteria? Do you check off the 3 out of 8? And then kind of this step 2 under the INA and then this test that was created, not just do you have these, but are you at the top of your field? And that is incredibly subjective. I mean, that is, an officer needs to kind of be persuaded that they meet the Kazarian second step. And that's the harder part, I think, of the green card side. But still a path that's definitely there, and it's not impossible. A lot of people get EB-1As. Not a lot, the extraordinary, but just know that you're going to have to prove up, I am at the top of my field, not just, hey, I've done all these things.
All right. So there are a couple of other categories that we want to touch on that aren't necessarily meant for entrepreneurship, but have created some options or ways to still start and run a business while you're in these categories. And one of them is for F1 international students. We do have very clear guidance from USCIS that says after you've graduated with your degree and you get this 1-year period of optional practical training, you can spend that 1 year working for your own company and building your own company. And so we do see a lot of students doing that, and then potentially you could move that over into an H-1B if you get selected in the lottery and are doing the kind of self-petition option. However, a lot of these people who do this are in STEM fields, and they have the option of a STEM OPT extension where they can get 2 more years of that optional practical training. The problem is, although OPT allows you to work for yourself, STEM OPT clearly does not.
Right. So you get 1 year.
Yeah. And so how do you, as a student, be able to, you've built this business over the last year, put all your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and now you have to give it up because you want to work for another 2 years? Maybe not. So that's when you need to bring in some partners who can hire you, fire you, pay you, supervise you, and prove that they will have that employer-employee relationship. These need to be people that are going to sign the I-983 training plan and show that they're going to be supervising and monitoring you. They should not be other F1 students. Agree. So you're looking at people that are in other visa categories or U.S. citizens, permanent residents, that sort of thing. But then it kind of, again, creates the problem of what do you do after that? Because now you've spent 3 years on this business. has it risen to the level where you can potentially get that O1? That might be hard to do in only 3 years, but it's definitely, there's unicorns out there.
Of course.
Or do you sponsor yourself for an H-1B under this new lottery, under this new regulation, but you have to go through a lottery? Are you going to get selected?
Yeah, and then are you a treaty, from a treaty country for an E,
Visa.
So it kind of has that weird pitfall of being short term, but it's done. I mean, we've talked to a lot of people on F1. They started a project as, kind of their master's practical or their PhD practical, whatever it might be. And it's like, I don't like this. And they continue it after because it has to be in their field of study, right? Yeah. You can't just decide. There's a famous one at Texas A&M where I went that one of the business school projects was a frozen yogurt shop. Well, you got to make sure that's in your program. So if you're STEM field, it needs to stay in that. But certainly done a lot, right?
Yeah, and then one other place where F1 students have employment authorization, we call CPT, or curricular practical training, almost exactly like OPT, except you're doing it while you're still in school before you've graduated. Now, I've looked through the regulations and the guidance, and there's nothing saying you can own your own business and basically do your own CPT. There's also nothing saying you can't. But I've had some DSOs push back and say, well, there's not going to be enough supervision of you. You're not supervising yourself.
To train that.
So that might be less useful, but maybe if it's part of, maybe you're taking an entrepreneurship course at your school and the school grants CPT to allow you to be more active in the business that you've created, that might be an option as well. What about dependents? If you're not the main person, but maybe you have entrepreneur goals, you want to start your own business, are there any ways available for dependents on other visas to do that?
There are certain dependent categories. You're the spouse. It's not for the children. It's usually for spouses only. In fact, I think only for spouses only. For certain categories, H4 has the H4 EAD. And L2 and E3 spouses have the right to work incident to status. Wasn't always that way. We were part of the lawsuit that challenged that because that's what the INA says, the Immigration Nationality Act says. But these are unrestricted rights to work. What does that mean? You don't need a employer sponsor. It's not like H-1B where it has to be in a specific field or a treaty country or extraordinary ability. You can kind of do whatever you want. Now, why were these created? Because people that are married to high-skilled immigrants tend to be high-skilled themselves, and we want to attract that. I mean, just law of averages is how it works out. So it's out there. L2E spouses, H4 EADs are out there. It does not work for O. There is not one for that, or F1 spouses.
Yeah, one thing that we have to be careful of for H4 EAD spouses specifically is the potential that there might be a gap in employment authorization. And this was a big problem under the previous Trump administration. H4 EAD renewals were taking forever. We sued multiple times. And eventually, lawsuits that we were a part of were able to create the H4 EAD automatic extension, which has helped, but it doesn't help everything, because if your H4 has not yet been extended, then there is no auto extension. So there's still potential for gaps in employment authorization. And as we're moving into the Trump administration, where they are no longer bundling the H4 EAD with the H1B holders extension, that's going to be more likely to happen. So what do you do if you're running a business and then you lose your employment authorization for 4 months, 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, that first Trump administration, when we were seeing this, one, litigation can work in certain circumstances, but that's nuanced. And have a backup plan. Have somebody that can kind of jump in that doesn't require the sponsorship, or you guys aren't tied together, that can help run the business if you have to take some time off. Because, businesses don't slow down because of immigration. They've still got contracts, deadlines, employees, and all of that. So just kind of having that structure and planning, just like you've got other business planning, what's that, you have to take one more step of what's going to happen if I have to travel, or I've got to renew my visa and it's delayed. So just come up with those plans when you're doing it.
All right, and then a last situation that comes up quite often for people who are in the very last step of the green card process. They filed their I-485 application to adjust status, and it's pending forever. And while it's pending, they get the benefit of an EAD, Employment Authorization Document. So that allows them to work, even if they already have employment authorization through their non-immigrant visa, they can continue their non-immigrant visa. But this EAD card is kind of a backup plan or another way that allows them to work. And so a lot of people kind of use that as a way to start something on the side, which is totally fine, because you will keep your main job that qualifies you for the green card, because all of that is usually based on sponsorship if you're maybe have gone through the perm process, for example. But you can also use this EAD to start any business and do anything. There's no restrictions on it as long as it's a legal business and it doesn't have anything to do with marijuana.
It's always the one, right? And none of our clients have come to us and said, I want to start a marijuana shop. And I always just lighten the mood. Like, that's always, I feel like the horror story that's out there is states that it's legal that be careful. You can't do that even if it's legal in your state. You can't sell marijuana.
Yeah, so that's a good option if you're kind of just sick of waiting and just want to kind of start some things on your own. Also, if you are in that 485 adjustment of status process and you, depending on the type of company you built, if the work that you would do for your company is similar to the job that you were originally sponsored for by your employer, you could potentially port your green card to your own company. Through that I-485 Supplement J form that people normally use when they move companies while they're waiting for their green card. But you could port to your own company. That is an option as well. So all of that to say, we do not have a startup visa in this country. We don't have a nomad visa either. So a lot of what we've talked about are just kind of ways to work within the system that wasn't designed for this. So yeah, I don't know. Final thoughts?
No, I mean, it's always something. People come in and think, okay, I can't tell me how many times. Like, I have a business idea I want to start in a week. Like, I'm coming in. Like, it's got to come through a lot of different paths. You would think we want this, and there's a lot of planning, but it does take that effort and planning and being strategic, right, on how we're going to do this. Especially with things like green cards kind of being in flux. We got a visa bulletin today, things forward, backwards, whatever. So what is the strategy, not just next month, not just 1 year from now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What is your immigration strategy? And you got to think that through when you talk about a startup.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for this week's episode. I wanted to mention next week we are going to shake things up a little bit. We have a special guest, Ryan Wilk, who is a partner in our office who handles national interest waiver cases. He is going to be coming in and giving us the lowdown on what that is, who qualifies for it, kind of what they're seeing in adjudications right now, as we've received a request for that from one of our listeners. So if you do have any requests for things that you'd like us to talk about, definitely give us a shout out on social media. We'd be happy to help.
Thanks, everybody.